reading this morning comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 32, beginning at verse 22. And again, as I mentioned to the children, we are continuing the story of Jacob after he has been called by God to return back to his land and toward his brother Esau, who upon hearing of his coming is coming to meet him with 400 men. The same night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jacob. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Have you ever experienced a dark night of the soul? A time when sleep eludes you and no one can comfort you. A time when you wrestle with anxiety about what the future will bring. A time when the past haunts you. It can no longer be avoided, so you have to face it. You have to give an accounting of past sins. Such a time has come for Jacob as he returns to his place of birth and must face his brother Esau. Esau, whose death threats had driven him away in the first place. But the stakes are far higher, even than they may seem at first glance. Jacob is not just fighting for his own life. He is fighting for our life as well. Jacob, as we have affirmed over the last few weeks, is no ordinary figure in history. He is one of the founding fathers of the faith. He is, as he will be renamed in today's passage, Israel. As such, he is the human bearer of the promises of God for all humanity. Our fate then is inexorably bound up in his fate. So his journey through a dark night of the soul can perhaps shed light on our own journey of faith and our own struggles. In truth, we have more in common with Jacob than perhaps any other biblical character we have encountered so far in the book of Genesis. He is all human. Perhaps one might even say all too human. But it is his complete humanity and all its strengths and imperfections that make him both so real and so compelling. If the promises of God can survive and even thrive in the likes of Jacob, there certainly is hope for us as well. Conversely, however, if the promises of God cannot redeem an imperfect vessel like Jacob, what hope is there for any of us? Indeed, this has been the unresolved tension, the drama that has driven and will continue to drive the biblical narrative. every good creation of God to date has decayed and died over time. Now the promises of God are not material creations, but have been, as it were, placed into human vessels. First Abraham and Sarah, and then passed on to the next generation of Isaac and Rebekah, and now to Jacob. But already, in the third generation, one has to wonder where it is all heading. Which in the end will prevail? Will the weak vessel of humanity fail to support the promises of God, or will the promises of God finally support and redeem weak humanity? That is, will human sin finally destroy God's promise to reconcile us to God and God's self, or will God's promises themselves finally reconcile us to God and to one another? Now, these very promises to God are repeated to Jacob by God in a dream, which we read last week, when he flees the wrath of his brother Esau. One could argue, though, that these promises of God, which eventually did reconcile Abraham and Sarah to God, have now become a curse that drives humanity away from God and from each other. Already in the third generation after Abraham and Sarah, Jacob has tried to steal the promises of God from his own brother Esau and has had to flee Esau in order to escape being killed by him. Seems a very real possibility that human sin, once more, has destroyed God's good gift. First, creation, and now, God's promise of a good future. Or has it? Years later, God tells Jacob to return to his place of birth, which means he must face his brother Esau. Now, possibly, just possibly, time, which up to now has been the enemy of God's good creation, since over time everything decays and dies, has become the friend of God's promises. Maybe time has allowed God's promises to heal old wounds, for faith to mature, for a reconciliation to take place between two brothers who had spent their youth as adversaries. But how can Jacob know? He has sent word ahead to his brother that he is coming, and only receives word that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men. Esau, who last encounters with Jacob were filled with hatred and death threats. Esau, from whom he has taken the birthright and the blessing of their father. This Esau is coming to meet him with a company of men that could easily destroy him and his entire family. Yet he goes on, sending gifts ahead, dividing his entourage so that some might survive if he is attacked. But he goes on. Why? Why risk everything and everyone on such an uncertain future? Why? Is it because he is a changed man? He has wrestled with God in his dark night of the soul and has emerged with a true appreciation of the guilt of his past actions and a true desire to be forgiven by his brother Esau. He is now willing to trust God and risk even his life to fulfill his place as the bearer of God's promises to the world? I rather doubt it. If Jacob had wrestled with God, and there are a lot of unanswered questions about the identity of the person that Jacob wrestled with that night, but if he has struggled with God and prevailed, as the man stated, this was hardly meant to be taken as a compliment. Instead, this encounter represents his stubborn refusal to change. Jacob has prevailed in the sense that even though he bears the promises of God, he is still a deceitful, conniving person who can talk the talk but cannot walk the walk. Indeed, interpreters of this text point out that Jacob's limp represents far more than a physical malady. His spiritual failings are now manifested outwardly in his inability to walk straight. But if this is the case, we are left with the same question. Why does he go on? He is not the one who is interested in reconciliation. God is the one who has sent him back to his place of birth. He was the one who wronged Esau and fled. And even as the bearer of God's promises, Jacob, has not changed. But he rather has striven with God and humans and has prevailed. But if God's promises have not been able to change the bearer of those promises, what can the bearer of these promises, Jacob, expect from his brother Esau, against whom he has committed so many wrongs? The future does not bode well for Jacob, but he goes on. Why? It is the promises of God themselves that move even one like Jacob, even ones like you and me, to continue on the path toward reconciliation. And this, I believe, is the point. I'll say it again. It is not necessarily guilt or desire to return home or even a renewed sense of self, inward commitments that motivates Jacob to face Esau. Indeed, it is not from within, but it is the promises of God themselves from without that overcome all obstacles, fear, doubt, dread, anxiety, and uncertainty, and leads Jacob to limp toward his brother. There is no indication that this is his chosen path, that this is what Jacob wants to do, or that this is a course of action that he believes in. Yet this is what he is called to do, and despite his grave reservations, he stays the course. What about you? Who is the Esau in your life? We all have one. You are the bearer of the promises of God for the world, the ambassadors for Christ. The promise of God is reconciliation with God through Christ that leads us, like Jacob, to confront Esau. The thought of such a confrontation can lead you, like Jacob, to a long, dark night of the soul. Yet even if you prevail and stubbornly refuse to change, you will nevertheless continue to limp forward, for God's promises will never abandon you. However imperfectly, the church continues to be a vessel of the promises of God. We continue to limp forward even though reconciliation may be the last thing on our mind. We continue to be ambassadors for Christ. Through thick and thin, friends, God is making his appeal through you. Let all God's people